What's up people, welcome back to the channel. So before we get into it, make sure when you're watching this video that you click the like button. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. So I'm going to be going through RDLs, going to be going through my competition bench press. So this day has been slightly changed around since I put up the last video, which the last time I made this video was like completely a pull day, whereas now it's pretty much RDLs and then push. All of the exercises I was doing in the previous video, they're still in my program, they're just rotated onto different days. Now, I think it's really valuable for every single training day to have an exercise on the plan that you are going to be super excited for. Or another way you can look at excited is like kind of like anxious, right? So RDLs, they are an exercise that like when I do them, they light a fire inside me. Like, you know, they make me really interested in training session. They are something that, you know, it is kind of a little bit scary, kind of hinging over at the hips and bending over a really heavy weight. They're very different to performing something like a machine-based exercise like a leg extension or a line hamstring curl first, because you can't switch off. If you're bending over with a heavy weight, you really need to focus on everything. You need to focus from the ground up, from your foot pressure to the tightness of your lats, to how tight your grip is on the bar, to how controlled you're going into that hinge position and going into the bottom position. You can't afford to let your mind switch off. You really have to be switched on. And that does allow you to kind of set the tone for the rest of the training session, which is why I like to always start off my training session with an exercise like this, which is going to make me slightly anxious, slightly fired up, as well as excited to come in and progress. And if you don't have exercise like that on your training days, if you have no exercises at all on any training day, which does not light a fire in you, it's going to be very hard for you to kind of give your full effort to those training sessions. Because if you're going in and you're just kind of going through the motions in your training sessions, you're not going to be putting your full effort into sets. You're not going to be getting the results that you could potentially if you were picking exercise that did light that fire. That's one of the reasons why I do powerlifting. It makes me very focused on 3 specific lifts to improve them. The RDL is a lift that if I improve this, it could improve my deadlift. So there again, it's all kind of feeding into this kind of one specific goal, but all the exercises on the plan, they do contribute to the bigger picture. So that's essentially what you want to think of. You want to have exercises on every single day, at least one, which is going to make you really excited for training. You also have to know that those exercises are contributing to the grander goal. Because if there are exercises in your program which you're not really sure why they're there, then that calls for either you to question your program and question your coach, or question your own programming and your decision making in putting those exercises in your plan. So I'm going to get into my top set here. It's 455 pounds, going to go for around 10 reps, and we'll see how we go. Two things I'm thinking about when I am unracking that bar on the RDLs. Number one is foot pressure. I'm trying to keep that bar over the center of my midfoot, and that's exactly where I'm trying to keep the pressure. I'm not shifting it all the way out to my heels. If I go all the way back onto my heels as I hinge at the hips, I'm going to have my toes come off the ground, and I'm not going to be able to output as much force as I potentially could in that bottom position. Similarly, if I'm on the front of my foot, my heels are going to come off the ground, and you know, the bar is going to be in front of my foot then, and then I'm going to pitch forward. So it's better to keep the bar over the center of your foot. So as you're coming down, what you're really trying to think about doing is pushing down through your big toe as well as your heel, and trying to keep that pressure as rooted into the floor as you potentially can. The second one that I'm thinking about is keeping my hand pressure on the outside of my hands. So when I have my hands on the bar, I'm almost like trying to do this when my hands are on the bar. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going into external rotation. That's going to allow me to contract my lats a little bit more. My lats are going to be stabilizing my spine as I'm going into that bottom position and stop my spine from completely flexing. And then by virtue of doing that, I'm able to just solely focus on hinging at the hips versus trying to actively stop my spine from bending, right? Because I'm able to kind of externally rotate the arms, contract the lats, as well as having my shoulders depressed. So my torso is as rigid as possible. And then I can just focus on hinging through the hips. So they're the two main things I was thinking about when I'm performing this exercise. So one thing you probably noticed I wasn't doing on those RDLs is I wasn't going all the way down to the floor or as low as I possibly could. There's two reasons for that. The way I'm performing the RDL, I'm trying to keep as much of the tension on my glutes as I can. And because of that, that means I'm only trying to go as far as my kind of hips can flex, versus if I was going all the way down to the floor, what happened for me to go all the way down to the floor, so my knees would start to shift forward, and then essentially I'm bringing a lot of quads into the bottom end portion of the movement. Then the other reason for it is I wasn't going as low because I'm going from the floor on the likes of my deadlifts. If I go all the way down to the floor, I'm going to have a little bit more kind of flexion on my spine as well. My lumbar spine, be loading the erectors a little bit more, which I don't want. I'm going to be heavy squatting on Sunday. So there should always be a reason and some kind of thought put into the range of motion you're using, the load you're going to be using, the rep range you're using. Like, it's all part of the program. So one thing I don't want people to get mixed up with is when I was performing the RDL, just because I was trying to bias my glutes, does not necessarily mean that the hamstrings weren't being worked either, right? As I'm flexing my hip and keeping my knee in pretty much an isometric and not letting it move forward, the hamstrings are going to be getting lengthened through the hips because the hamstrings cross the hip as well as the knee. So they're still getting trained there. However, they'd be getting trained more if I went through more range of motion and kept my knees straighter versus with that slight bit of bend in them. Now, when we're trying to do any kind of compound movement, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to isolate one specific muscle. We can definitely bias it through shortening a range of motion or cueing the movement slightly differently in the way where maybe applying foot pressure or something. But believe you me, if you're performing a hip hinge, a heavy one especially, it's likely that a good few muscles are contributing. Your erectors are definitely contributing, your glutes are definitely contributing, your adductors, your hamstrings. You can't isolate just one through such a demanding lift. Now, I'm onto this hamstring curl next, and the reason I'm doing a seated hamstring curl versus doing a lying hamstring curl is because I'm going to have my hip flexed, okay? Have my hip flexed as well as extending my knee. I'm going to be getting in a greater stretch through all of the heads across the hip, as well as the knee, as well as the one that crosses the knee. Okay, so there's biceps femoris across the knee. He has the likes of semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris long head, which all cross across the hip as well as the knee. Now, when you're performing it in a lying fashion, you have your hip extended, so you're not getting as much length into the ones that are crossing across the hip, and mainly going to be training the biceps femoris short head, which is crossing across the knee. So I'm using this versus lying hamstring curl for that reason, because I'm able to get more length into more of the hamstrings, as well as it's more stabilized, right? With the likes of the RDL, I'm having to utilize a lot of my core stability to brace myself when I am going down into the bottom of the hinge, whereas I have to do the exact same on the likes of a lying hamstring curl. Because you don't have any external support other than the pad that you're lying on, you have to really try to kind of keep your core locked in, keep your hips forward. Whereas on this, I can use the external stability of the machine. So I have my hips pressed into this. I'm trying to keep my torso in more of a neutral position versus having it completely laid back or like almost kind of flexed forward. I'm using my hands to push into this. Then I have my feet on this pad here, which I'm using to scoop my calves into my hamstrings. This is super important because the stack is pretty light. So I'm using this just to continually add load to the likes of the stack. So I can continue adding weight as opposed to just continuously adding reps. I'm going to use a different hamstring curl, however this one definitely feels the best. If you want to build complete hamstrings, I think it's pretty necessary to have something like a seated hamstring curl in your program. The reason for it being is like with the likes of RDL or a stiff leg deadlift, while we are going to be challenging the hip extended portion of the hamstrings, and to a degree with the stiff leg deadlift, depending on how stiff you can keep that knee, you could also be challenging the one that crosses across the hip and the knee. It takes a lot of skill to get as close to failure with the hamstrings as you can on that exercise because it requires so much skill. Whereas if you are utilizing something like a lying hamstring curl, you can eat that little bit more out of your hamstrings. Now, the likes of that RDL, the likes of the stiff leg, other muscle groups could be recruited and take away the tension from your hamstrings. Again, because we can't control which of those muscle groups is contributing the most to that movement. Whereas the likes of this, where you are pretty much isolated, you're pretty much just isolating your hips in the flex position, you're isolating knee flexion, you're going to be able to get those hamstrings as close to failure as you potentially can. So that's why I think it's a good idea to have something like RDL or a stiff leg deadlift in there for some heavy loading, as heavy loading as you potentially can get, and then finish off the hamstrings with something a little bit more isolating. Similar to the way that if you're doing a bench press, you might finish off with a chest fly, or if you're doing a dip, you might finish off with a tricep extension. You go from heavy compound into your isolation, rinse the muscle. And just to follow on from that, I think it's really, really silly for you as a trainee, if you're interested in strength or muscle building, to just like put yourself into one camp of like machines are the best or barbells are the best. Like, I love using both, and I can see the utility in using both within your training. Again, if we kind of stick on this example of like the RDL and a stiff leg, because you can target so many different muscle groups with one big shotgun-like exercise, that reduces a lot of other exercises that you maybe have to do within your training program. If you're considering the likes of like stiff leg or RDL, like how many people are doing isolation exercises to build up their erectors? Like, I see very little people using a back extension machine, right? Using a back extension machine, then using like a glute isolation machine, then using a hamstring isolation machine, and trying to isolate every single aspect of your body. It adds in a ton of exercises to your program, and then it also makes your training program very fragile, because if you go to a gym that doesn't have those machines, what the fuck do you do? And that's why the likes of barbells can be so useful, and why I try to base a lot of my training around using barbells as well as using the likes of machines, because you create a lot more like anti-fragility in terms of your programming. You are able to reduce the overall time that you spend in the gym to build up like a complete physique. And I definitely do think there is utility in having those kind of compound lifts, which are maybe building up some muscle groups that you're not even really thinking about when it does come to isolations. Like, we could look at the likes of leg training. A lot of guys will do the likes of leg extension or a line hamstring curl, but they might forget completely about the adductors, and then they're standing on stage and they have a massive gap between their legs. You know, so these are things that we need to kind of think of when we're picking our exercises. RDLs will target those adductors, like your leg press will target adductors, your barbell squats. But again, you know, we don't see many guys on the adductor machine, so we need to make sure that we are building a complete physique if we are going to be, you know, thinking about bodybuilding, and that means we're going to have to use a variety of different implements, whether that's machines or barbells. On the bench now, just completed my top single, and that was a little bit of an overshoot, right? But I picked that weight based off what I did last week, so I did 155. That was 160, which to be fair is my competition max. And I based it off how last week went, as well as how my last warm-up felt. So my last warm-up felt pretty decent. It felt like that kind of increase was warranted. However, it just didn't move too good. So look, not going to think too deeply into it, just going to get into my volume now. So one thing I'm thinking about here when I am setting up for the bench press is you'll notice that, you'll notice from the warm videos, that I have this bench raised onto two plates. That's because this bench is like way too close to the floor, and all the other benches that are here are pretty much the same height. Because it's too close to the floor, it means I'm not able to get as much kind of leg drive and set my arch as well. So I'm just simply elevating the bench with just like two plates, which I definitely think if you're in a commercial gym and they have benches which don't feel right, like try do some adjusting. Like, some of them are too narrow for a lot of people's backs. So one thing I recommend a lot of clients do, if they have yoga mats in their gym, is like put it over the bench, because it widens the base of support. If there's a wider base of support, you're going to feel more stable on the bench. You're going to be able to press bigger weights. So the unfortunate decision is that next week, because that top single was an overshoot, I am going to have to reduce the load, which is obviously a little bit of a dent to the ego. However, I'm not here to train my ego at the end of the day. As much as I would love to see weight being added to that top single every single week, unfortunately, strength doesn't always go like that. As much as we would like to see these numbers go up every single week, or, you know, I could like say that was a lower RPE than it was to make myself feel better. At the end of the day, the RPE is what the RPE is. It's not what you want it to be, it's what it is. And it's really important to be honest with them, because otherwise you can end up making your expectations far too high, and then you get to your competition day and you have this inflated E1RM that you've been kind of basing your kind of numbers off, and then you go to hit it in the competition and you end up bombing out or end up falling short massively from what you thought you were going to do. So it's really important when it does come to radio RPE that you do be very honest with yourself, because ultimately it's in your best interest. So now we are going to be moving on to our machine chest press. So I really like these prime machines. You can essentially set the machine to be heavier in specific ranges of motion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on setting 5. Setting 5 is to load it in the mid to lengthened position. So it's going to be hardest at the bottom and a little bit easier at the top. But I'm probably not going to fully extend my elbows as I would get towards the top, because here tends to be like the most kind of fatiguing position, and I'm going to fail here earlier than I'll fail down in this kind of bottom position. So I want to get a little bit more kind of tension into my pecs. Now, one thing that I want you to kind of pick out on, first of all, as doing my bench press, is I'm keeping a closer arm pat. So you see I'm kind of gripping in here versus out wide, similar to the way I would have done my bench press. The reason for this being is because I'm actually trying to train my chest here. And I wasn't trying to train my chest in bench press. I was just trying to perform the bench press. I was trying to move the weight. Whereas when it does come to this machine, right, and I want to actually target my chest, I want to keep a closer arm pat, because when you think about the pecs are going to be connecting here, like around the upper arm bone onto the humerus. And we want to kind of think about the pec wrapping around the rib cage as you're bringing the arm into this kind of tuck position, right? The pec is starting to wrap around your ribs. It's going to start to lengthen a little bit more. And then you kind of go across the body and think about touching the elbows together to contract it, okay? So I want to keep you closer arm pat versus having your arm in complete horizontal adduction, right? This kind of motion here, you're probably just going to feel your kind of shoulder joint a little bit more than you're going to feel your actual chest lengthen. So you want to keep a closer arm pat, wrap around the ribs, and then drive the elbows together. The way I am performing the sets on this, I'm doing 4 sets of 8, and I'm using like reps in reserve or like RPE, as opposed to what you could do is half the amount of sets but go closer to failure. Now, what is the difference between doing either or? So if you take into consideration, I just did a lot of sets of bench press there, right? Heavy sets of bench press, very demanding in terms of my central nervous system. Then to go straight into 2 sets all out to failure, well, that's a lot more work for my nervous system to deal with. It's a lot more work for like connective tissue to deal with. So if I go on to doing a few more sets, slightly lighter weight, keeping a little bit more kind of reps in the tank, I could potentially be a little bit kinder to my nervous system, be a little bit kinder to my joints, be a little kinder to my connective tissue, but still get the same outcome. So probably the final cues I'll give you for this: brace as much as you can from the ground up, right? Feet driven into the floor. So you see when I'm actually kind of setting up here, I'm getting my foot down on this thing to kind of help me get the weight out. But as soon as I do, I'm gripping my foot into the floor as if I'm essentially doing a squat. Hands driven into the pads, of course, but then I'm also thinking about kind of pushing myself into the pad as I'm pushing away. So I'm thinking about kind of pushing the handles away, also push my back into the pad just for a little bit more kind of power output, and then drive the elbows together. to my final press movement of the day. Bench press, obviously sport specific. And then when I looked at the likes of the machine chest press inside, I'm mainly looking to target more of the kind of upper to middle chest fibers. So the way you can target specific divisions of your chest is through the arm pad that you're using. All right, so when we consider how I was pressing on a machine chest press, my arm pad was more in this kind of upward path of motion. So the pec fibers that are running this way, they're gonna be pulling on my humerus as they go into this path of motion with the arm. Now with the decline, or the more kind of dipping path of motion, I'm gonna be targeting more of the kind of costal fibers, which are gonna be running closer to your ribs. So again, keeping that arm pad close to my side, think about the pec as it kind of lengthens around the rib cage, and then these fibers are gonna be pulling on my humerus downwards and contracting and getting exposed to a little bit more tension. So definitely playing around with the arm pads, depending if you have parts of your chest that are a little bit lagging, or if you just want to bring up your chest overall, you know, implementing a variety of kind of arm pads in training is probably going to give you the best results. Second last movement of the day is going to be this flex leverage row. With this machine, the thing I'm looking for mainly is an upper back emphasis, as well as it to be heavier in the lengthened position, but have a drop off in the mid to short. What makes for more of an upper back emphasis? Well, it's going to be your arm position relative to your torso. So if you have your arms a little bit more abducted, okay, a little bit more away from your sides, it's going to put the lats in less advantageous position to pull the humerus, right? If you think about the lats, right, they're going to be pulling down the shoulder extension. You move away from that position, they have less leverage. Then it's going to turn into the likes of the teres major, right? That's going to work in horizontal adduction, pulling the arms back into the body. We have the rhomboids, right? The rhomboids are going to be assisting in elevation and retraction, as well as the likes of the rear delts. They'll be pulling the arm backwards as well, pulling the upper arm in this path of motion. So if we're thinking about biceps and the upper back, we're thinking about moving the scapula through protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. Mostly going to be elevation, because we're going to be getting the traps, the rhomboids in that position. And then we also want to think about keeping the arms away from the side. One thing I like to think about is my arms kind of essentially scooping away from my body. And that essentially allows me to kind of think about, okay, the scapula pulling on the musculature around them, pulling on the arms into that position. Anyway, I'm going to finish off this session with some machine lat raises, but I'm going to wrap the video up here. So if you did enjoy the video, leave any comments if you have any questions. If there's anything I said that kind of provoked some thought, or if there's anything that I was unclear on, just drop a comment. Happy to explain my kind of thought process or any other cues that you may be unsure of. And if you did enjoy the video, make sure to like it, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll catch you in the next one.